They notice the empty space you leave before they even realize it's gone. Your absence becomes the mirror of their weakness, reflecting how much they depended without awareness. And suddenly, the calm they took for granted is fractured, quietly, dangerously, irrevocably. Every pause you take, every step back, is a revelation of control. They measure, they calculate, they feel the shift, but you remain untouchable. By the time this unfolds, you will know how disappearance is power, not escape. When you vanish, the first sensation they experience is not anger, not even curiosity, it is confusion, a subtle but deeply unsettling disorientation. They are confronted with an empty space they didn't even realize was defined by your presence. Most people operate unconsciously within the frameworks shaped by those around them, relying on subtle cues, your energy, your attention to guide them without acknowledging it. The absence of that guidance is like a sudden crack in a foundation they assumed was permanent, leaving them momentarily unmoored, uncertain, and instinctively searching. They do not immediately recognize that your withdrawal is deliberate. Instead, they instinctively sense that something fundamental has shifted, and that the stability they depended on is no longer guaranteed. This confusion carries power because it forces reflection. People are rarely comfortable confronting the truth that their normality depended entirely on someone else's consistency. They replay interactions in their minds, scanning for signs they may have missed, for moments they should have capitalized on, for indications that their influence over you was ever real. Very few understand that the mere act of stepping back, of refusing to participate in the predictable rhythms they rely on, is a strategy far more effective than confrontation. Silence, absence, and inaction communicate authority in ways words never can. The gap you leave is not empty. It is charged with meaning, a psychological mirror reflecting their reliance, their assumptions, their vulnerabilities. In that confusion, they begin to test boundaries without even knowing it. Small actions, subtle inquiries, tentative attempts to reinsert themselves into your orbit. They measure reactions, gauge your attentiveness, and, without realizing it, reveal more about themselves than they ever would in ordinary conversation. Their behavior becomes less controlled, more transparent, more revealing of the unconscious structures they take for granted. This is the first ripple of power your disappearance generates. It forces awareness without confrontation, influence without effort, and recognition without instruction. They are learning your value not through argument, persuasion, or demand, but through the absence of what they had come to rely on without consideration. Confusion is the silent teacher, and few are willing to learn. Most people respond with irritation or denial, pretending that your absence is inconsequential, while internally their sense of equilibrium is shifting. They are confronted with an unspoken reality. The world they navigate is subtly structured around your presence, and without it, they feel exposed. This exposure is not something that can be undone with apologies, excuses, or social maneuvers. It is a permanent recalibration of perception. Every glance, every message, every attempt to regain footing becomes a measure of how deeply your presence shaped them, and how strategically your withdrawal communicates control. By the time they fully register what has happened, the confusion has done its work. They are thinking differently, approaching interactions more cautiously, and reassessing what they assumed was stable. The awareness of absence is more powerful than confrontation because it is internalized, it is experienced in real time, in subtle emotional tremors, in the quiet, creeping recognition that their position, their influence, their assumptions, all are conditional on someone else's choice to engage. This is the first and most essential stage of strategic withdrawal, the moment when absence speaks louder than presence, and when control is asserted without a word. After the initial confusion settles, what follows is a surge of insecurity, subtle, pervasive, and quietly devastating. They are forced to confront the reality that your absence exposes more than just a physical gap. It illuminates their own fragility, their dependence on someone they previously underestimated. Most people never realize how much of their confidence, their social footing, and even their sense of identity is intertwined with others' presence until that presence is removed. They experience an internal tremor, a questioning of significance, a silent calculation of what their lives would be without the constant reference point you provided. This insecurity is not merely emotional, it is strategic. It triggers self-scrutiny and forces them to evaluate their position, influence, and the assumptions they built around your involvement. Insecurity manifests in subtle ways. They replay interactions, dissect conversations, and reevaluate their own behavior through the lens of absence. Every missed opportunity, every unspoken thought, every micro moment is magnified as they search for meaning in your withdrawal. Most people mistake insecurity for weakness, but those attuned to power understand it differently. It is a measure of your influence, revealed quietly and without your intervention. The more dependent they were, the sharper their anxiety, the more profound the realization of their own reliance on you. They may attempt to mask it with composure, with overcompensation, or even with bravado, but the internal recognition cannot be denied. You are no longer simply an actor in their social equation. You are now a variable they cannot control, a force they cannot predict, and a presence they cannot replace. This surge of insecurity also recalibrates their perception of time and priorities. They start to notice what they previously ignored: your opinions, your influence, your patterns. Things they once took for granted now carry weight, because the absence of these signals makes them realize how much guidance, structure, and subtle direction you provided without anyone acknowledging it. In their minds, a series of questions emerge. Did I rely too heavily? Was I too casual in my approach? Did I underestimate the significance of what they brought into my life? These questions are uncomfortable, intrusive, and unavoidable, and they are exactly what makes your strategic withdrawal so powerful. As the realization deepens, they begin to experience a subtle form of fear, not the immediate, reactive fear of danger, but a slow, creeping awareness that their control is limited, that their social positioning was contingent, and that their assumptions about stability were fragile. This is the point where insecurity becomes an internal dialogue they cannot escape, a recalibration that happens below conscious awareness, shaping their decisions, their judgments, and their future behaviors. Their confidence, once steady, now fluctuates in response to your absence. Every interaction, every decision, every thought is measured against the silent standard you have established merely by stepping back. Insecurity, when experienced in this controlled and calculated way, is an instrument of influence. It shifts perception without confrontation, reshapes behavior without argument, and imposes subtle recognition of power without needing to assert it verbally. Those who feel this insecurity are learning lessons about presence, value, and dominance that most people spend years trying to understand, often failing. They come to see that power is not always loud. It is often defined by restraint, timing, and the deliberate choice to let others realize their dependence. This understanding, quietly embedded, changes their actions, their awareness, and their assumptions forever. Following confusion and insecurity, what emerges is a subtle, almost imperceptible sense of urgency. This is not the frantic panic of unpreparedness, but a quiet, internal drive to reclaim what has slipped from their grasp. Your absence creates a void they did not anticipate, and suddenly their calculated world feels incomplete. They instinctively recognize the value you brought, the stability you offered, and the authority your presence silently commanded. Unlike many who react loudly, most people experience this urgency in restrained, almost invisible ways, in careful observation, in tentative attempts at connection, in the quiet recalibration of priorities and strategies. Their internal clock accelerates without them even realizing it, and every decision, every interaction, is now measured against the void you have left. This urgency manifests as subtle testing. They probe, they reach out, they measure your responses in minute increments. The questions they ask are not always explicit, but every glance, every word, every gesture is a quiet attempt to assess whether influence can be recovered, whether the equilibrium they relied on can be restored. The irony is that in this state, their transparency is heightened. They reveal more of their dependence, more of their strategic thinking, more of their own vulnerabilities than they ever would under normal conditions. Absence forces them to act unconsciously, and in doing so, they inadvertently teach you about their true priorities, insecurities, and attachments. This sense of urgency also carries a subtle psychological weight. It is a reminder that influence is never permanent, that respect and attention are earned continuously, and that the illusion of control is often fragile. By stepping back, you expose the gap between perception and reality, the difference between what they believed they could count on and what they actually depend upon. Most people never encounter this truth because they are either unaware of the leverage others hold over them or unwilling to confront it. Your strategic withdrawal creates a mirror that they cannot look away from, forcing reflection without conversation, influence without speech, and recalibration without argument. The tension generated by this urgency reshapes behavior. They become more cautious, more deliberate, more attentive to subtle cues. Their previous assumptions about relationships, influence, and value are challenged, often without their conscious acknowledgement. Even attempts to regain footing, a carefully timed message, a calculated gesture of attention, an effort to demonstrate relevance, are now filtered through a lens of self-awareness imposed by your absence. They learn that influence is measured not by presence alone, but by consistency, by impact, and by the silent recognition of authority. In this state, urgency is more than reaction. It is an unconscious acknowledgement of power. It demonstrates that the social and psychological space you occupied cannot be ignored, trivialized, or replaced easily. They are drawn into a mental calculus, reconsidering priorities, adjusting behavior, and recalibrating strategy, all without confrontation, all without explicit guidance from you. The effect is long-lasting because it embeds awareness. At a foundational level, absence has a voice, and it speaks louder than presence ever could. Ultimately, the urgency they feel is a quiet confession. They are aware of the gap you leave. They recognize your value, and they are compelled, internally and often invisibly, to respond. This is the essence of strategic withdrawal, shaping perception, behavior, and recognition of authority, without overt action, without explanation, and without needing to assert dominance. In the silent tension that follows, power is acknowledged, recalculated, and respected, leaving them subtly but unmistakably changed. As confusion fades and insecurity settles in, guilt begins to emerge, subtle, quiet, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly influential. This is not the overt remorse of an immediate misstep. It is a creeping recognition that their actions, assumptions, or inattention may have contributed to the dynamic that allowed your absence to resonate so powerfully. Very few people recognize guilt as a tool of influence, yet it is one of the most effective. It forces introspection without confrontation, reflection without guidance, and recalibration without instruction. They start replaying interactions in their mind, analyzing every word, every gesture, every moment in which they could have acted differently. The silence you leave becomes a mirror, reflecting not only what they lost, but how they underestimated the subtle power you wielded. Guilt carries a silent weight because it operates below conscious awareness. They are rarely able to articulate it fully, but its influence shapes behavior in ways both visible and invisible. They begin to notice the moments they took your presence for granted, the opportunities they failed to recognize, the casual disregard they once applied. In doing so, they are learning, quietly and involuntarily, the consequences of their own inattention. Most people never understand that power is often defined not by what is said or done, but by what is withheld, by what is removed, and by the absence of reassurance. Your withdrawal forces them to confront the realization that their assumptions about stability, influence, and control were flawed, and that their confidence was built on dependency rather than merit. Guilt also triggers a subtle internal dialogue, one that they cannot silence. It is the quiet questioning that infiltrates their thoughts. Did I overestimate myself? Did I misread the signals? Did I fail to appreciate the presence that mattered more than I realized? These questions are uncomfortable precisely because they have no immediate answers. They are forced to grapple with the consequences of their unconscious reliance on you. And in doing so, they begin to internalize the value of what they lost. Unlike fear or urgency, guilt is reflective. It shapes understanding slowly, but permanently, and it encourages behavioral adjustments that can last far beyond the immediate experience of your absence. The most important aspect of guilt is that it is self-generated. No words, no confrontation, no external pressure is required. It arises naturally in the context of your withdrawal, as they compare their assumptions to reality and confront the gap between what they believed and what is true. This creates an environment in which influence is exerted silently. Every misstep they imagine, every opportunity they perceive as missed, reinforces your authority without a single word of explanation. They are aware of the power you possess, and they feel its consequences intimately, because it is reflected in their own internal reckoning. By the time guilt takes hold, they have been subtly recalibrated. Their awareness sharpens, their self-reflection deepens, and their understanding of influence evolves. They recognize that dominance is not merely physical or verbal. It is psychological, strategic, and often invisible. The absence you orchestrate teaches them lessons about attention, respect, and reliance that no conversation or confrontation could. Guilt becomes a silent acknowledgement of your power, an internalized truth that shapes behavior, perception, and ultimately their relationship to you and others. After confusion, insecurity, urgency, and guilt, what emerges is a profound shift in observation and behavior. They begin to notice more and speak less. Every interaction, every movement, every word you once offered freely is now analyzed in the context of absence. This is not mere curiosity. It is a subtle recalibration of their social and psychological positioning. Your withdrawal forces them into vigilance, compelling them to observe, measure, and calculate with precision they never needed before. Most people are unconscious in their interactions, acting without awareness, taking others' presence for granted, and assuming influence is static. By stepping back, you expose the fragility of that assumption. You make them aware that they no longer have unchallenged access to your attention, your energy, or your engagement, and that awareness is quietly transformative. Observation intensifies because they are now operating under a subtle threat to their perceived control. Without confrontation, without argument, without direct challenge, your absence creates a void of uncertainty. They scan for signals, searching for meaning in gestures, inflection, timing, and body language. Every interaction becomes data, every reaction is scrutinized, and every assumption is questioned. The very act of watching silently, of measuring carefully, is an unconscious acknowledgement of your influence. They are being shaped not by what you say, but by what you do not say, by the space you occupy in memory and in expectation. Most people never understand that influence can be exerted through omission, through restraint, and through strategic withdrawal. They are discovering this lesson firsthand, without guidance, without being instructed, and without even realizing the full extent of the transformation. Silence in this context is not empty, it is a statement. It communicates autonomy, control, and deliberate awareness. By observing more and speaking less, they are forced to confront the power of restraint. Your absence acts as a lens, magnifying the gaps in their understanding, their assumptions, and their confidence. They begin to notice subtleties they once overlooked, the patterns of behavior, the timing of gestures, the nuance of influence you carried without ever needing to assert it overtly. This vigilance generates self-consciousness, a quiet tension that shapes their choices, guiding them toward awareness of your autonomy and the limitations of their own reach. As observation deepens, hesitation follows. The sudden awareness that your influence is not granted freely creates a cautiousness in their approach. They reconsider what to say, how to act, and how to respond. They become more strategic because the old assumptions no longer hold. They understand, consciously or not, that influence is not a commodity to be demanded, but a privilege to be earned. Each interaction now carries weight. Each gesture is measured against the reality of your absence. This subtle tension is the essence of power realized without confrontation. The shift in hierarchy is quiet but irreversible. They are aware of the space you occupy, even when unspoken, and they cannot ignore it. Finally, this heightened observation and restraint create a psychological dependency that is invisible yet undeniable. They begin to internalize lessons about autonomy, attention, and influence. Your absence teaches them the limitations of assumption, the fragility of control, and the significance of presence. It is a demonstration of power that bypasses resistance, argument, and rationalization. By observing more and speaking less, They are acknowledging authority, recalibrating their behavior, and reshaping their perceptions, all without a single confrontation. They are learning that dominance does not require noise, that influence can be invisible, and that the most potent form of authority is strategic, measured, and silent. This stage, more than any other, solidifies long-term recognition of your control. It is quiet, relentless, and permanent. Those who observe more are forever changed, acutely aware of absence as power, and painfully conscious of their own limitations in response. Your withdrawal is not just a lesson in patience or timing, it is an enduring recalibration of awareness, a subtle demonstration of dominance that leaves them permanently attuned to your presence, even when you are gone. Once confusion, insecurity, urgency, guilt, and observation have taken their course, a more subtle, insidious emotion begins to emerge: resentment. This is not the overt anger that provokes confrontation or argument. It is quiet, simmering, and internalized, a reflection of their awareness of limits, dependency, and loss. Resentment grows from the recognition that control is not theirs to command, that influence cannot be reclaimed through force or demand, and that the dynamics they once assumed were stable are now fragile. They begin to feel the boundaries of their own reach, the inadequacy of their strategies, and the subtle power you have wielded without ever speaking a word. Most people never identify this as a psychological pivot. They mistake it for irritation or dissatisfaction. In truth, it is acknowledgement of your authority, a recognition that they are playing a game in which they are no longer in full command. Resentment is deeply tied to awareness. As they replay their interactions, analyze your absence, and recognize the structural influence you exerted, they feel the weight of limitations they had never noticed before. Every decision they make, every step they take, is shadowed by the understanding that they were dependent on your presence more than they realized. This is a quiet, almost invisible form of power. You are not dominating through confrontation or assertion, but through the careful exposure of their reliance and the demonstration of autonomy. Resentment reveals their subconscious calculation of what they have lost, what they cannot control, and how far-reaching your influence truly was. The most striking aspect of this emotion is its dual nature. On one hand, it creates discomfort, a tension between desire and inability, between ambition and limitation, between confidence and vulnerability. On the other, it drives unconscious recalibration. They become more attentive, more cautious, and more analytical, learning lessons about boundaries, influence, and strategy without anyone teaching them directly. They begin to recognize that the structure they relied upon, the presumed stability of relationships, influence, and attention, was conditional, and that autonomy is both rare and powerful. Resentment, in this sense, is a teacher disguised as emotion. It forces introspection, encourages behavioral adjustments, and silently enforces recognition of authority. Resentment also fuels subtle attempts to regain footing. They may overcompensate in their interactions, analyze every signal for potential leverage, or seek ways to restore influence. Each action is constrained by the internalized understanding of limits. Every move is measured against the invisible power you continue to hold simply by remaining unattached, independent, and strategically silent. They may not consciously admit it, but your absence and the restraint you exercise create a psychological environment where your influence is maximized without speech, argument, or visible enforcement. Ultimately, resentment is a reflection of realization. They are forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that influence is earned, that control is contextual, and that the power you possess lies not in aggression or confrontation, but in autonomy, strategic timing, and deliberate detachment. Those who feel it deeply are subtly recalibrated. Their perception of relationships, authority, and their own limitations shifts permanently. Resentment becomes a silent acknowledgement of power, an involuntary lesson in strategic mastery, and an internalized respect that cannot be extracted through persuasion, negotiation, or confrontation. In this quiet tension, power is recognized, boundaries are recalibrated, and awareness is sharpened. The lessons of absence, independence, and control embed themselves without discussion, leaving them conscious of the influence they cannot reclaim and the subtle authority you continue to wield. Finally, after confusion, insecurity, urgency, guilt, observation, and resentment have taken their course, what emerges is fascination, a complex, layered emotion that blends fear, admiration, and curiosity. This is the most subtle and enduring reaction your absence can produce, and it is also the most powerful. Unlike previous responses, which are primarily reactive, fascination represents a conscious and unconscious acknowledgement of authority, influence, and strategic mastery. They are no longer simply processing what is lost or trying to regain footing. They are captivated by the reality of your autonomy, the control you wield through silence, and the lessons embedded in every interaction you allow yourself to step away from. Fascination is a recognition that some power cannot be contested, measured, or manipulated, and that true mastery often lies in the ability to remain unseen, unclaimed, and strategically detached. Fascination is deeply tied to the human psyche because it engages both conscious reasoning and instinctive awareness. They are drawn to you not out of immediate desire, but out of a recognition that your behavior, or deliberate absence, has created a space that cannot be ignored. They replay your patterns, reconstruct your intentions, and search for meaning in ways that are often invisible even to themselves. Every decision you make, every moment you step back, becomes a reference point for their evaluation of influence, strategy, and authority. Unlike anger or insecurity, fascination does not dissipate quickly. It lingers, shaping perception and subtly guiding thought long after direct interaction has ceased. They begin to internalize lessons about timing, restraint, and presence that are almost impossible to articulate but impossible to ignore. Fascination also carries a quiet fear, the recognition that your autonomy is not something they can challenge or manipulate. This fear is not loud or overt. It is an internal acknowledgement of boundaries and limitations. They realize that influence is not a commodity they can reclaim at will, and that your strategic silence represents more than withdrawal. It represents mastery, choice, and self-possession. The tension created by this awareness is potent. It forces them to respect the unspoken rules you have established, to measure their own behavior against the invisible standard you have set, and to recognize the subtle power of deliberate absence. Unlike confrontation, which is temporary and reactive, fascination embeds itself in perception, creating a long-term recalibration of their understanding of influence. Curiosity accompanies this fear, driving them to analyze, question, and anticipate your next move. Every gesture, every signal, every decision you make becomes a puzzle they cannot fully solve. They attempt to predict, to decode, and to reclaim an understanding of control, but they are consistently reminded of the limitations of their own reach. This is the final lesson of strategic absence. You are teaching them that mastery is not about dominating every interaction, but about shaping perception, guiding thought, and asserting influence in ways that cannot be countered or forced. They are learning that power is exercised not only through action but through timing, restraint, and the deliberate choice to remain untouchable even in withdrawal. Fascination is also a subtle acknowledgement of respect, admiration, and the recognition of competence. They are drawn to your ability to remain calm, detached, and strategically aware, even as they struggle to regain balance. Very few understand that true dominance is quiet. It is not announced through loud gestures, threats, or arguments, but through measured absence, controlled presence, and the deliberate shaping of perception. In this state, they learn lessons about self-mastery, social dynamics, and the invisible architecture of influence. Your disappearance becomes a living case study in strategic behavior, teaching them how power operates at a level most people fail to perceive. Ultimately, fascination is the culmination of all prior reactions. Confusion revealed gaps in expectation, insecurity exposed dependence, urgency tested reaction, guilt forced introspection, observation instilled vigilance, and resentment marked recognition of limits. Fascination completes the cycle, embedding awareness, shaping perception, and leaving an indelible imprint on thought, behavior, and strategy. It is an acknowledgement that influence and authority can be exercised without noise, without confrontation, and without argument. That true mastery is measured in the subtlety of absence, the precision of timing, and the quiet assertion of autonomy. In this final stage, they are permanently changed. They have been exposed to the invisible forces of control, subtly guided toward awareness and left to wrestle with the lessons your absence imparts. Fascination, in its full depth, is both recognition and transformation, the silent acknowledgement that you are not merely present or absent, but strategically untouchable, shaping perception, behavior, and understanding at every level. Like or subscribe, and remember this: your presence is a gift, your absence is power, and the world only learns the difference when it is too late.